Hi, good evening everyone and good morning to friends from USA. I'm Ajit Kumar, 1988 Civil. May I welcome you all to our session 10 of our series Masterclass. As we have written in our presentation, this week we are going to conclude our first season with this particular session. As you all know, we have started in June 2020 when all the lockdown was on all our places due to the corona pandemic. We are now with our vaccines and all. We are coming to nearly the end of the corona period. So we are taking a step back to see how we can actually make a better and improved version of the masterclass. So please wait for some time for us to come back to you. We have tried to bring very, very different topics presented by people who are masters in their own fields to you to make it interesting. And we have a YouTube channel where you can find all of the presentations and the question answers. We have been always in the last 9 sessions also, we have been thrilled by the support and extended to us by all chapters and CETA main mother organization itself, CET faculty and students, various chapters wherein we have a lot of participation. Mainly, at this moment I would like to take the names of Trivandrum chapter, Chennai, Bangalore chapter, and UAE, USA's various chapters. They all Singapore and many times Australia. Despite the time problems with these countries, many people participate in our program. We have representation from 1961 to the newest batches also, and generally we find that 84 batch, 78 batch, and 87 batches are our most strong supporters. Thank you all for being part of this thing. We have been extremely thrilled with the support. As I said earlier, our peak registration was about 395 and on an average we have about 250 plus registration, and 221 people have taken an option for auto register, so that they can always be in the know what programs we are bringing out. And 53 of our CETians have participated in every single of our program on live. And many CETians have asked us whether their kids can listen in, and we have permitted all those things. And the feedback you have been giving us, the guidance being given to us are tremendous. I would thank for all those continuous support which we have been receiving, and please rest assured that we will be back with a slight modified version of the masterclass. And I need to thank a lot of people in our group who has taken a lot of their time to guide the speakers, how to make the presentations to a multi-discipline group like ours. I would like to name all of them probably, because this is the end of the season. Please bear with me for a couple of minutes. I would like to thank Mr. NCS, Mr. NC Shekhar, who also did the first presentation on this. Mr. Muralidharan, Mr. Rajiv, Mr. Sabu, who's currently not here in Mumbai, Mr. Pradap Kumar of 84, Mr. Papan, we all have been, trying very, very hard to bring this program to a very interesting one for all the public who are watching us. But as you all know, we are almost coming to an end of COVID era, and hopefully this thing should disappear pretty soon. And then we also thought that we need to change a bit of format to get more wider coverage and more interesting programs brought to you. So with that, may I welcome you all to another interesting session from Urmila Rajyatheeksha. She is an architect from our 1987 batch. I will request Papan to formally introduce her and take the program forward. Thank you very much for being part of this program. Papan, over to you.
Good evening once again, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to be back with you all for the season finale of Masterclass Season 10. Session 10. Season finale, it's Season 1, obviously. So, like Game of Thrones or any other long-running web series and OTT platforms, we'll be back. You know what Season 1 has got. It's got the feel and the vibe of the program. We got the gist of the talent we have. And, from beginning last year to the journey so far, it's been outstanding and wonderful. Nothing short of outstanding and wonderful. So we have discovered some of the finest minds in CET, and the best part is that we know that there are so many hidden gems in there. We know some of them. We'll be going after them. We'll be hunting for them, and we'll be back. But before that, it's my honor to introduce Urmila ma'am here. Urmila Rajyatheeksha passed out from CET in 1987. She did architecture. After that, she moved to SPA Delhi for her masters in again landscape architecture, and she completed her masters in 1990. She moved to Mumbai in 1992, and she joined LS Raheja for a year. And after that, she's been on her own and teaching. In 2016, she started a master's program, and she is the founding head of department for the LS Raheja School of Architecture, which offers courses in Masters of Landscape and Art. She's a mother, daughter is a CA, her son is an upcoming economist. And best part about her is that, I've personally had some interactions with her. We have talked about architecture and landscape, and the passion she exudes, the idea she has, the one she has executed, the ones not yet executed, but she will eventually. All the best to that. And without taking much more time, and hoping to see you all for Season 2 when we come back bigger, stronger and brighter. Over to you, Urmila. The floor is yours. You're on mute, I guess. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Papan and Ajit, for that introduction. And it's an honor to be the finale presenter at the masterclass session. It's been an excellent session, with each one growing and improving as we go. So thank you for that. Maybe I'll not spend more time, but go straight onto my presentation. So good evening, everybody, right here in India and across the globe as well. And welcome to, maybe I should say, my world. So my topic is a landscape approach to life. And my tryst with landscape architecture began after moving out of CET, actually, after completing architecture for my masters. So I was actually recollecting those days when this opportunity came up. The days of going through CET and then moving on, early days of education, when life was much simpler. We didn't have so many complicated gadgets to handle. Google didn't exist. Knowledge was in books. But then, we are probably the generation who moved on, and here we are. So when we moved on from college and school education, early education to architecture, a lot of notions that we came in was that education was very simple. I mean, you read books, you wrote exams, you did well, you got high marks. All of that went for a toss starting from architecture. And yet, somehow or the other, as we spent through our years through CET, my batch, which actually was incidentally the first batch that entered CET through a common entrance exam, somehow came to be known as a very good batch. I don't really know why or how, but we are very happy to be known as such. So it was during my days in CET, when I was in my third year of architecture, that Professor Ravindra Bhan, who founded the Masters in Landscape Architecture, came and presented to us. And it was entirely, I would say, due to his fascinating presentation that I went on to study landscape architecture. So in a few years, I was in MLA from Delhi, Masters in Landscape Architecture. It's called MLA. And of course, being a GATE scholar helped as well. So in 1990, when I graduated and earned my degree, I did become a landscape architect thanks to my training. But it took me a while to understand the significance of what we call as landscape architects the landscape approach. And this was something that we were actually trained in. I'm using the word trained in purposefully over here, because training becomes a habit and gets ingrained in your way of thinking and functioning, and it actually gets into your psyche. So, landscape as a word has multiple meanings and definitions. However, it usually gets referred to visually. So it's almost, when you look at it visually, it's whatever your eye can see. Expanses and distances, large words, characterize it. But actually the visual is just a part of it. Landscapes also include the overall composition, spatial structure, and aesthetic values of an area, together with its meanings and associations for different segments of society. Now, this includes the notion of the sense of place and identity that communities attach to their local environs. Much of these notions, real as they are, defy boundaries and restrictions. It also includes the resources and services a landscape provides to those who inhabit it through each other. So landscape is experienced and not just seen. Interconnectedness is intrinsic to landscape, and boundaries keep changing depending on how you view it. So beings big and small, not just humans, but even the smallest of microbes to the largest of creatures, would describe their landscape differently depending on their viewpoint. So you live in the midst of landscape, but you can describe it only from the vantage point of distance. So maybe if we look at describing a few landscapes. Now this is a photograph of a coastline in Northern Ireland. For most of us who may not have been there, I mean, it doesn't really mean much. But if we look at it a little carefully, the coastal landscape of Ballintoy County, Antrim, Northern Ireland has got this thick vegetation, thick by their standards, on top of limestone cliffs overlooking the Irish Sea. The seabed beneath. The North Channel of the Irish Sea is an underwater landscape, well known for its denizens, the fish, crab, sharks, and hundreds of varieties of seaweed. These landscapes teem with life, though probably our tropical landscapes do even more so. So moving on to landscapes which are very different in how they look. These are golden desert sand dunes. Dunes are here today, gone tomorrow, depending on how the wind takes them. The patterns that you see on the dunes are also formed due to the winds, and generally they indicate the direction of the wind. So the side which has lesser ripples is the side which faces the wind. Landscapes like this change very quickly and may not be recognizable as the same the next day. So coming to another very different kind of a landscape, these are the Bryce Canyon hoodoos. So the landscape of Bryce Canyon, which is in Utah, USA, is dominated by hoodoos, as they are called. These hoodoos are nothing but rock formations and formed by ice and rainwater, which erodes the soft rock. So in Bryce Canyon, the soft rock is sandstone. And a hoodoo landscape is not unique to Bryce Canyon. It's also there in other countries like Cappadocia in Turkey and Wanli in Taiwan. So here this picture which I'm sharing with you is that of a Florentine landscape in Florence. So the crowded homes and apartments of Florence, Italy are home to the cultural landscape of the Renaissance. Florence famously was home to artists like Leonardo, Michelangelo and Donatello, writers like Dante Alighieri, Niccolo Machiavelli, political leaders such as Lorenzo de' Medici, and scientists like Galileo Galilei. This photograph is one of a landscape which is deliberately designed as such. This is the Garden of Versailles, designed by the legendary Lenotre and by the order of King Louis XIV of France, where vast gardens were laid on land that necessitated several changes in topography. This is situated to the west of the Palace of Versailles, and the gardens cover some 800 hectares of land, much of which is landscaped in the classic French formal garden style, which was perfected by André Lenotre. Since then, they have been renovated several times over the years and remain an example of what was considered as man's power over nature. Now, landscapes have meaning to us due to our associations with them. So for most of us, with our touch and our roots back in Kerala, the landscapes of Kerala, like this one of the backwaters, holds a lot of meaning. Or even this one, which is of the paddy fields and coconut trees, with the sunlight streaming through and the shadows. Or even this one, which is the tea garden landscape of Munnar. And why is it that they hold this meaning for us? It's because we associate our memories with it. So a famous landscape architect called Tom Turner, who's a landscape architect, garden designer, garden historian, and a teacher at the University of Greenwich, felt that the arts that we now call garden design and landscape design have three separate origins: in the sacred space, the horticultural or agricultural space, and the domestic space, meaning the space that people live in. So like Homo sapiens, our species, the arts of garden and landscape design probably spread to Europe, where he is, from West Asia. So I am not very sure that this is absolutely true, and it may be debatable, but the typologies that he's described, in a way, describe the landscapes inhabited by humans for centuries. So when you talk of sacred landscapes, the first thing that comes to mind are ancient sacred groves. So in Malayalam, we refer to them as a kava. Here in Maharashtra, they are called devrais. So the concept of a sacred grove is unique and mixed with religious beliefs, taboos, purity, and probably environmental conservation, though that is not explicitly said. A sacred grove is a small patch of land with a few particular types of trees and creeping plants usually growing in and around it. The local community protect the area and treat it as a holy place. They devote it to their local deities and ancestral spirits. Every sacred grove has its own legend and lore in the oral tradition of the communities who have handed them down through stories and songs over centuries and generations. The people usually hold a strong belief that any activity that will destroy their sacred grove will invite the wrath of their gods on them and will culminate in a disaster. So this strong belief in fact works in a way to protect the sacred groves and keep them the way they are. Thus, the people protect them as a community custom and also believe that if they are protected well, they will bring them good fortune. This one, which is Matri Mandir at Auroville, is a modern sacred landscape. Unlike the sacred groves, it's more about the visual form and the shape and the perfection with which it is made, which lends it its aura. So the Matra Mandir and its surrounding gardens, though not associated with any particular religion or any sect, is designed as the center of the city of Auroville, and it's known as a peace area. It's visualized as a space for self-realization. So here this is more about the self, and that's probably what's reflected in its form. The perfectness of its symmetry and crafted form focuses the mind, and it is extremely unlike the natural form of the sacred groves, but a sacred space nevertheless. So the adaptation of land for horticulture or agriculture usually creates its own typical landscape. And here these rice paddies in Indonesia have been so for centuries together. And how is it that they were maintained that way? So the cultivating of rice was based on terrain and the flow of water into the system, and it's held in place by a belief system which is manifested by the temples, which have held this landscape and its inhabitants together for years. Contrasting with that is this field, which is more like the modern industrialized agriculture, which is vast in size and rolling out for acres and acres and characterized by external inputs, unlike the closed system that we saw earlier. So when looking at domestic or inhabited landscapes, I chose the example of Japan because there is a continuous tradition of Zen gardens over there. So this is what a typical ancient Zen garden would look like, with all its rock garden, sand garden, rocks placed, and typically selected vegetation. What this really involved was that the processes, the raking of the sand to create the pattern, was something which the inhabitants were involved with on a daily basis. So the garden was actually part of their life as well. Now, a modern Zen garden in a modern home, within its glass encased exterior, is more like an object to look at, though visually it carries images of the same. So landscape architects thus shape the world we live in, and in turn shape the experience. So coming to some iconic and well-known works designed by landscape architects, this image is of Central Park in New York, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in 1858. Frederick Law Olmsted and his partner Vaux actually won the competition for this park, which is in downtown Manhattan. It was a rocky area which had depressions, had shanties in it as well, and the design that they evolved was largely inspired by what they had seen in the United Kingdom, the gardens of the United Kingdom. But this vast and iconic space is one of the landmarks of New York even today. It's had its ups and downs. There was a time when it was derelict and occupied again by shanties, and today is managed by the Central Park Conservancy, which is a group of people who have got together. So it is actually the stakeholders who have kept this park going. Most landscape works, maintenance is a very important part, and the involvement of the stakeholders is extremely important. So placemaking is one of the concepts in landscape architecture, and it's not just about designing a park or plaza with efficient circulation. It involves taking into account the interrelations between the users, which include not just the people who visit the park, but retailers, vendors, the amenities that are provided, the activities that take place over there, and the fine-tuning of the space with the landscape, which with changes like additions of seating, and all of those elements mesh together, they blend together. So this particular space is an exercise in placemaking. This is called Freeway Park and is designed by Lawrence Halprin, who's another legendary landscape architect who worked out of the USA and Israel. And this park actually spans, if you can see this section, a freeway, a highway, which was built in Seattle. The highway, or the freeway as it's called there, when it was built, cut the city of Seattle into two. And the people of Seattle were extremely upset by that. So they commissioned Lawrence Halprin to create this park, which bridged the two parts together. So this actually goes from the Washington State Convention Center and First Hill, and it sits atop the section. It caps the Interstate 5, and it has a road called the 8th Avenue bridging over it. So it's an exercise in exploration in the vertical dimension as well. So the work of landscape architects involves conceptual and detailed design of environments, which range from streetscape, playgrounds, and so many others which I've named over here. This image is from a memorial to our late Prime Minister Indira Gandhi called Shakti Sthal, situated along the river Yamuna bank in Delhi. The brief that the landscape architect Ravindra Bhan was given for this particular project was that it should be reminiscent of her memories of Kashmir. So meadows and trees and such like. He actually stretched it a little further by going ahead, picking up a statement that she had made on the day when she was assassinated, that should she die on that day, her blood would irrigate the land of our country, and included a function of a geologic park where he selected nearly 60 tons and more weight of stone from various parts of India and brought them and established them here in this park. His thought also was that leaders come and go and memories go, and then places which are open spaces and lungs for the city fall into disuse. But if there are multiple uses and they appeal to stakeholders, the park continues to live and lives for the city. So this is the Bay South Gardens, in the gardens, iconic Gardens by the Bay, Marina Sands, Singapore, designed and master planned by the landscape architect firm of Grant Associates in 2012. This garden is not just natural, but also an engineered structure. So it's famous for its super trees. You can see these large structures, some of which are 50 meters and more. These trees have multiple functions. They are clad with a steel cage on which plants grow, air plants as well as creepers, because that gives the tropical effect. And also they have solar photovoltaic cells on top to generate electricity. They collect rainwater. They're therefore not just there for their form, but they are functional as well. So when landscape architects work, landscape architects draw on their knowledge of landscape aesthetics, environmental design, analytical and problem-solving skills, technical capabilities, and their professional practice and management skills to create the spaces, amenities, add beauty, support the environment and the economy, as well as look into the social, health, safety, and welfare of the users. How is it that they do that? They actually do this because that's what their training involves. So there is a plethora of subjects taught by experts in their field to landscape architects when they study. So what this does is, it doesn't make them experts in, say, geology or landforms or climate or vegetation. Vegetation, for instance, is the botanist sphere. Geology, we have geologists. And not even in land use systems, but they become a generalist and also involve all experts in the work that they do. So there is a lot of input that goes into the subject of landscape architecture and a lot of interactions that they bring to the subject, and a lot of peripheral things which perhaps pertain to other subject. Planning and incentives would be the planning field. Tenure may be about real estate. Multifunctionality, value changes about economics, also gets into the projects that they do. So who is it that landscape architects collaborate with? Urban and regional planners, especially when they work on regions and cities. Environmental scientists and specialists for the specialized knowledge that they have regarding species, both plants as well as fauna. Construction managers and project managers while working on site. Surveyors, cartographers, and now photogrammetrists who work on either physical maps or satellite maps. And hydrologists and geologists and many others. So in India, landscape architecture has been around longer than landscape architects. The landscape architecture education course started in Delhi. Professor Bhan started it in 1974. But from time immemorial, we've been having landscapes which work. So a very classic example of this are the river ghats. These are the ghats in Varanasi, which are built on the edges of our monsoonal rivers. We live in a country with monsoonal rivers where the rivers during monsoon are in spate and otherwise recede. So the stepped formation of the ghats works very well and also protects the edge which would otherwise get eroded. So another iconic landscape architecture project, I would say, not done by landscape architects though, is our very own Marine Drive. All of us in Mumbai know the feeling of space, and I'm sure many others who visited too, that this gives a city, especially like Mumbai, and a sense of grandeur and a large scale. So this was part of the reclamation, Back Bay Reclamation project in 1920. Central Vista, which we are familiar with on Republic Day, if not any other time, is another such project. Planned along the slope of Raisina Hill in the background, where Rashtrapati Bhavan is, towards the Yamuna. This project evokes majesty and power. And though built by the British, and to many extent we do feel that this was an imposition of power, a lot of Indian things, and particularly the vegetation that is woven into this and the detailing as well, has Indian origins. So today it works as a place of pride for us. More than 100 years old, it is now due for a revamp. Controversial headlines on which you would have read if you're reading Indian newspapers. In our city of Mumbai, we are lucky to have a forest within the city. So this is Sanjay Gandhi National Park, which is our very own city forest, and probably one of the factors that still keeps us a little better off than we perhaps would have been, and has been designated as a protected area from 1942 onwards in various parts, and was formally designated as the Sanjay Gandhi National Park in 1996. Another landscape of Mumbai is the park known as Maharashtra Nature Park. Along the banks of our Meethi river, many of you may of course ask that where is the river? Designed by Ullas Rane and in collaboration with the Worldwide Fund for Nature and executed by the National Parks of USA, this park was actually built on the dumping of construction debris. But right on the debris, a thriving forest has arisen, and it's a much needed lung for our city of Mumbai. So landscape architecture design, like many other fields, also has a lot of theories, some of which are overlapped with a few other fields as well. One of these is the theory of placemaking. Placemaking is considered as the making of space into place and is associated with the public realm. When we talk of the public realm, we talk of public outdoor spaces. So public outdoor spaces are a common good. They are there for everybody and can be made to come alive through an understanding of how humans instinctively relate to them, and the design leadership that leverages this knowledge and active programs for and by communities which are of civic benefit for everyone. Placemaking activates our built and lived environment. This stretch is Carter Road in Bandra West. So Carter Road's edge prior to this development had been deteriorating and had become shady and unsafe for people to use. Drug trafficking and other things like that happened. So, led by the MP at that time, Shabana Azmi, and pushed a lot by Mr. P.K. Das, who's an architect and urban planner and an activist, this finally took shape, and the design of this was done by a landscape architect called Suvarna Sathe. So, despite the irregularity, spaces were carefully taken and interwoven together, and it's been highly successful and brought life and safety to the place. It is also one of the venues for Celebrate Bandra and other festivals in Bandra. So this is placemaking within the headquarters of the MCGM. The MCGM is nothing but the BMC, as we usually call it, the Municipal Corporation of Greater Mumbai. This courtyard lay within the iconic and Grade 1 heritage building of the municipality and was practically used as a dump yard. Old furniture, whatever was not required, was dumped into this area. It was reclaimed during the conservation and restoration project, which was spearheaded by the conservation architect Abha Narayan Lamba and Shimul Zaveri. And this is actually one of my own projects which I have done. So it is an irregular shaped courtyard, and the design was woven around existing elements. Like we had these palm trees. The palm trees were extremely tall, maybe a bit unsafe as well. But then the gardens department of the BMC would not give us permission to have them moved elsewhere. So we worked around them and made them a focal point. This stage, which can also work for activities that you see, actually has the firefighting tank below it. It had a specification that it has to be above ground so that water from the surroundings doesn't enter it. And we could not persuade the fire officer that we wanted it actually flush so that we could get more space, and also permit security vehicles to enter into the space when they are required. So instead we turned it into a stage. So placemaking involves small things like this which sometimes give big returns. So these are the steps which are known as the Mount Mary steps, the St. Stephen's steps actually, which leads up to the St. Stephen's Church in Bandra West. This is what they look like before this latest intervention, which just got completed in December 2019 and was a project of Alan Abraham, John Abraham's brother. So the modification that he did was, instead of having these derelict straight steps, he created steps with ramps in between. So people can use them, not just for cyclists who you see in this picture, but even those who are not so able. And with this and the multiple activities that were there, he also created a mid-landing which works as a center for activities. So the space is alive, and almost every weekend there is a small event happening there. Permitting, of course, if COVID allows and permissions allow. And again, it forms a very active space. Compared with its earlier avatar when you had a lot of antisocial elements, drunkards around the place, today the place is completely alive and safe and good to be in. So another theory that we have in landscape architecture is that of a cultural landscape. So this is a very broad theory and it embraces a diversity of manifestations, but basically it refers to the interaction between humankind and their natural environment. So this is the definition that is offered by the World Heritage Convention. So the rice terraces of Bali, which date back to century, are actually formed and shaped by the interaction of humans with the environment. So water management for agriculture determines how they are shaped. Temples in this area actually work as regulators for water, and the collectives, water collectives, are called subaks in this area, control and manage all of this. So these are also considered as World Heritage Agricultural Landscapes. This is another project of mine which also in a way qualifies for a cultural landscape. It is a front garden of the Prince of Wales Museum, known today as the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya or CSMVS. It's an awarded project and was lucky to win an honorable mention from the UNESCO Asia Pacific region. The museum was actually built at the beginning of the 20th century and was completed between the two wars. So at that point of time, a garden was not really a priority. It was used for other purposes, and eventually when it was formally inaugurated, by the time it was very close to independence. So this was actually an exercise where we kind of evoked what the garden would have been. The form of the Charbagh was laid. So the Charbagh was a necessity, and the building had a style of building which is called Indo-Saracenic, which was predominant in the colonial era. So Saracenic refers to Islamic. There were elements from Islamic architecture that were picked up, so that is why the Charbagh was definitely retained. Another consideration here was that the museum is run by a trust and there is actually no governmental support as we often perceive for it. So usually they get funds based upon whatever is given for a project, but maintenance, which is very important for a landscape, is quite difficult. So the species that we selected were very common species. You might find them everywhere. They grow. They are not very expensive. They grow fairly fast and can be replaced if it's required. This pattern of geometric parterres was evolved around existing features which were there. These statues were already in place and we didn't really want to move them because we did lack space within the museum building as well. So actually for me, because stakeholders are very important, one of the most rewarding experiences here was when a staffer from the museum told me that you've really made a huge difference to this place. Now when they are people who live and occupy these spaces every day and they see it every day and they still find that there is a difference and they feel the difference is sufficient to, compliment who's made it, that was really something. Now the museum also during these days of pandemic had recently established a children's museum which was in a more wooded part of the museum. So during the pandemic when the museum was shut and open space access was also limited and when things cleared up a bit, they allowed families to use the space by appointment so that they could experience at least whatever open space they could. And it was much enjoyed and much responded to by most people. So a third theory that I would like to place before you is the theory of landscape urbanism, which refers to landscapes in cities. Now generally we consider that cities and their landscapes are very different from each other in character, in their constitution and the scales as well. So landscape urbanism actually rejects the difference between the city and landscape and considers it as one. So it operates on vast scales, prepares an area for action and is less concerned by what things look like and more concerned with what things do. So it embraces the sciences of ecology and complexity because most urban problems are complex and encourages hybridity between the natural and the engineered systems, which very often are perceived as exact opposites for each other, and always looks for remedial opportunities. Many landscape projects actually came up on what are known as brownfields. Brownfields is a common term which is used for industrial or other such sites which have fallen into disuse. So this is the Parc de la Villette in Paris, which was built on the site of the slaughterhouse and market in Paris, which had fallen into disuse. There was a competition organized for this, which was won by an architect called Bernard Schouni. And what his thought was that this site, which even had a canal going through it, needs to be something that would bring people to it and which people would be able to interact with in their own way. So he didn't want to put elements which would be considered as, which would look the same if you visited day after day. An element that he introduced here was these red structures, which he called folly, and which were actually metal structures with different shapes and looking at different angles. So people when they came could in fact imagine and use them in different ways, have different views of them, and this has turned out to be a very successful park built in the 1980s. The Highline Park of New York is an iconic landscape which many of you may be aware of, and was actually shaped on a railway line which had fallen into disuse. Railway lines for freight, this was from the meatpacking district of Chelsea and its surrounds, had fallen into disuse after the highway network was developed because they were found to be far more efficient and their reach was faster, quicker, and more customizable. So a move was made by a builder and some other developers to demolish this line. So it was at that time that two people who from the locality took up their case and campaigned hard for turning it into a new use and not demolishing it. A photographer who actually walked the length and took photographs of the wildflowers on this, at that time, the naturally grown wildflowers, and exhibited them, helped them a lot in their campaign, which they finally won. And they formed a group called the Friends of the High Line. The Friends of the High Line hosted a competition which was won by James Connor's firm. James Connor is a well-known and reputed landscape architect, called Field Operations. Now this High Line that we see today is a collaboration between James Connor, Diller Scofidio and Pete Udolph, who specializes in naturalistic plantation. So this is Sundar Nursery, which was designed by my professor, Mohammad Shahid, and is situated in Delhi. This particular plot is in the neighborhood and in the region of Humayun's Tomb and other monuments, and originally was a smaller Mughal garden. During the period of developing of New Delhi, many species were tried here, planted here to see how they would respond in the climate of Delhi, and that's how the name of Sundar Nursery came about. So the Aga Khan initiative had taken up a renovation of the Nizamuddin area, which was called the Nizamuddin Renewal Initiative. So the Humayun's Tomb was one of the major projects in that, where they also involved the community from Nizamuddin village, who were actually originally the custodians of these tombs and had been restricted from going there during the British era. And he also added on this particular garden, which today is a large garden known as the Heritage Garden of Delhi. And it actually made it to the cover of Time magazine as well. So infrastructure, the third theory that I'm giving ahead, is generally seen as providing goods and services which are essential. It enables and sustains and enhances our living conditions. So what are infrastructure? Railroads, highways, airports. Those are the infrastructures of transport, or otherwise maybe STPs or waste treatment plants and many other such things which are purely generally associated with functional structures. But since the 1980s, scientists and conservationists have suggested that ecosystems should also be considered as infrastructure because they fulfill a lot of these functions. So usually these have been labeled as green infrastructure, and these are applicable to various settings, both in the terrestrial and in the water-based ecosystems. So they support and regulate services, and there is a huge emphasis on water flows in urban centers and the maintenance of biodiversity. This was a project which was not executed on ground, but was a manual that I had prepared for the NHAI, which is a National Highway Authority of India. This was actually a precursor to our times when we are much more familiar with the use of satellite images today, and we are slowly developing a bank of satellite images and data as well. So this was based upon how landscaping for a national highway in India should be looked at. We live in a country with many kinds of landscapes, many natural landscapes, and many of our highways run through various landscapes. Now, if you look at a highway which would run from Kerala to Kashmir state, there are many different landscapes that it would traverse on its way. Sadly, the notion of landscaping of highways that we see around is more dictated by its section than by the areas that it travels through. So in terms of modern plantation, which is, it's not that it's not thought of, it's guided by a thought that you should have plants which require little water, because provision of water along highways is difficult. But a highway in Goa looks almost like a highway in UP, or even maybe a highway in the northeast, except for the terrain, in terms of the plantation, which is not what it should be. So this is an image of the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in London, which hosted initially the London Olympics in 2012. Post that, and this was a post plan, which is something which is very interesting about this particular development, that equal or perhaps more attention was paid to what would happen to this project post the Olympics. And this was devoted largely to the development of biodiversity, and is today one of the largest such parks in Europe. This was planned by Landscape Architects and Master Planners ACOM, along with LDA, George Hargreaves and Associates, and several others. So this is an image from a park known as Freshkills, which was once one of the biggest landfill sites of New York City, in Staten Island. After its closure, they hosted a competition for the development of this with consideration to its ecology, and this was won by Field Operations, who were the designers of the Highline project that I mentioned to you earlier. It's an ongoing project with remediation and introduction of people building up over the years, and will reach full fruition maybe 30 to 40 years down the years is what is expected. This is an image from Rao Jodha Park, which is Rao Jodha Desert Rock Park near Mehrangarh Fort in Rajasthan. Designed by Pradeep Krishan, who is a self-taught ecologist. This was a barren and overrun land where the invasive species known as Prosopis had proliferated. Slowly and surely, involving the local people, the invasive species has been removed, because it's a very persistent species. They literally had to hand dig it out and still had recurrences of it, and native rock species have been reintroduced over here. Now, nature-based solutions, the previous example also was of nature-based solutions, are being propagated more and more. So this is an example from the Netherlands. The Netherlands, which many of you would know, are called so because they are a very low country, and most of their land is below sea level. We in Kerala also have lands like this. The Kuttanad region is something which many of us will know. So in the Dutch are always battling with the seas, and water is one of the most important ministries in their country. So in the 1990s, the episodes of flooding began increasing, and they realized that their solutions of dikes and windmills didn't seem to be working, and they needed to think afresh. So they realized that with frequent episodes of rain, there was a lot more water which needed to be accommodated. And if it wasn't given a space of its own, it would flood the areas where people lived. This was how the Room for the River began, with relocation of dikes and lowering of groins, depoldering, as in removing the walls which had the polders which accommodated water, and removing of obstacles, and giving space wherever it was possible for the water to spill over. Now, this is a small competition team where I was a part of the team. This was led by Vistar Architects and Planners and was a competition for Rajaswa Bhavan, which is the national tax headquarter for India and is the first winning entry, first prize winning. The site that was selected for this had a lot of trees growing in it. It had barracks and trees in between the barracks. So obviously we did not want to remove the trees and we did not want to cut off light from the trees. So instead, inspired from the trees, this form of pylons with buildings spreading above, like a canopy, was what was developed for this. This is an ongoing project which is as of now on the drawing board and based in the UK. So this is a riverside project and designed by the firm of Gustafson Porter and is situated in the floodplain of the River Thames. Now when we talk of the floodplain, we talk of the area in which the river, when it floods or when it rises, would enter. So one of the key aspects of this site, which is formerly an industrial site, was to provide accommodation for the river water whenever it overflowed the banks. Also to slow down the water which would flow down to the ground. So it involved rainwater harvesting from rooftops, creating of spaces which accommodated water, and this naturalistic setting that you see. This project is presently on the drawing board, but hopefully it will soon see the light of day. Thus, from looking at all these theories, the cultural landscapes and placemaking, ecosystems approach and green infrastructure, where landscape also is thought of like the ecologists with patch corridor matrix theory and landscape urbanism, what actually came across is that we live in a changing world. And in a changing world, we need resilience and resilient landscapes. This is where we take off for a landscape approach. So the landscape approach has knowledge from multiple sources, stakeholder participation, adaptive, because you need to be adaptive, management, appropriate in multiple scales, it works on different scales, multiple functions, and ecosystems based functions, and ultimately resilience. So it's interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral, and it has a holistic approach to overcome barriers by a sectorial thought. When you think of a sectorial, you would think of each of these individually. But in actual fact, they're interconnected, and if you do not think of the connectedness, then you sometimes come up with a lesser solution than what would happen if you think of all of these together. And that is the backbone of the landscape approach. So what are the main characteristics of the landscape approach? The landscape approach places communities at the center. It takes into account all actors. Now when you say all actors, they may be human or maybe others as well. It examines the entire landscape in which risks originate and manifest themselves, because that is indeed the critical part. It integrates ecosystem management and restoration. It manages trade-offs, because ultimately no solution is perfect. What is required for the time is something that we need to understand. It's flexible for future changes and it demands for a long-term perspective. So with all the climatic emergencies and environmental emergencies of our time, when nations got together to make the Sustainable Development Goals, they actually found the characteristics of the landscape approach helpful in formulating these goals, the SDGs as they are called. So if I were to simplify the landscape approach into 7 steps, what would it involve? It would begin with an initial assessment of the landscape. Step 2 would be to conduct an in-depth stakeholder and power mapping. a detailed mapping of what is available, stimulate multi-stakeholder meetings and create coalitions of the willing, those who are willing, conduct a collaborative in-depth and solution analysis. Collaboration is actually the key word. Carry out collaborative action, organize collaborative implementation, and promote adaptive management. So broadly, these are the 7 steps that are involved and put together like a puzzle for the landscape approach. As you can see, they're put together and they fit together. Now, this is a small project that I had done where I was retained by the UNDP for the greening of the Indira Awas Yojana. The Indira Awas Yojana is meant for giving houses to communities who cannot afford them, and the people who are the beneficiaries are nominated by the Gram Sabhas. Now, while it is about giving houses, there's a slight catch there because it really is not possible for the government to give houses all over the country. So what the government does is that they give grants, which is a fixed amount. Now what very often happens is that the amount which is given is not really always sufficient in a way for the communities, for the kind of houses they live in, because our rural communities are not just human beings who live in the house. Their cattle and a lot of the equipment that they use in the fields, all of this gets accommodated in their houses. So they live very differently. And the reasons why they need money is very often something which is an urgency before their own house. So if money was given to them, very often it would get spent in a wedding or in some other emergency and would really not be there for the house, and the houses didn't happen. So this was also a challenge along with the greening, because ultimately we want the houses to happen. So after studying what was happening because of the Yojana, I was appointed for the state of Maharashtra. We requested for a demo situation. We also conducted workshops with their personnel, but we got conflicting signals from them because they were very driven by the targets that the government imposed. The Yojana is a central government Yojana. Today it's known as the PMAY, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Gramin. So we asked for a community, a village, which would have around 15 beneficiaries, as the beneficiaries were decided by the criteria of the income. We allocated a village in the month of March in the year 2016, about almost 3 years and about 6 months after we submitted our initial report. And this was a village called Hateri. Actually, the two, Hateri and Malgar, which come under the village of Hateri in Konkan, which is actually in Jawhar. So what we discovered first and foremost is that our idea of, managing resources because of, cutting down on transport as well as houses were nearby was not at all the situation. The villages were distributed over huge distances in what are called padas over different hills. So we began our study, the landscape approach again, with a inventory of what they had and understanding the local typology of building. So these were their materials. You may not view them as house building materials. We in the cities don't view it that way, but their houses were built of these and many others. We also drew out the houses they were living in because those would be their notions of what a house should be like. So this is what I mean by saying that these were their houses. They are very large compared with what we consider budget houses here in our city life. So we had several discussions with them on design options. We were in March, and June with its torrential monsoons was not far away. So we didn't really have time for drawings. So we adapted by creating models, and we were not even very sure that they would understand the drawings. These drawings were created more for our documentation purposes. When we had these conversations with them, we also discovered that the government processes of issuing their installments had not really got action. And they were they were almost at the brink of the monsoons. So they told us that we are not going to work on these houses unless we get the money, because we need to also get our fields ready. And if we don't get our fields ready, we're going to starve for the rest of the year. So we went back to the government, and ultimately it was on the 21st of April, even nearer to our deadline of June, that the first installment was received and they were willing to work. So it was a crazy and almost a daily affair. These are members of my team who were interacting with the beneficiaries. But we managed to build 5 of those houses just before the monsoon set in. Basic walls and shelters in the roof to shelter them, and the rest went on after that. So another example of a project where the landscape approach was used is the Arka Valley project. Some of you may have heard of the Arka Valley coffee. So these are an Adivasi community which were enabled by non-profits to develop sustainable farming practices in agroforestry, composting, crop rotation, and crops like millets and many other crops were favorable to their location were used. So pulses millets ensure the food security of the Adivasis and also improve the ecosystem and enable them to develop the coffee, which is today a world-renowned coffee. Now, can landscape approaches be used in businesses? Now, sustainability in a business is as weak as its weakest link in a chain. And the weakest link is probably the single supply chain that many businesses use. So applying these theories to these activities by making it multi-stakeholder and cross-sectoral could help businesses and communities they serve to achieve sustainability goals. I can't really give you an perfect example because there are businesses who use this in parts, but hopefully we should get there. And coming to a landscape approach to life, if you've noticed, the landscape approach has been used where there is a lot of uncertainty. And I think we've lived through and are living through some of the most uncertain times most of us have ever seen in our lives. So maybe we could apply the 7-step process that we spoke about earlier to looking at how we could address our times and get through and live through our times. So this is a little bit of something like a message that I would like to send out for all of you. So what were those 7-step messages? The first was carry out an initial assessment of the risk landscape, which I think we definitely do. Conduct an in-depth stakeholder analysis and power mapping, which is what I think powers most of our WhatsApp groups and more. Stimulate multi-stakeholder processes and create coalitions of the willing. The fact that these particular master classes themselves started during COVID times and brought us together, like maybe a lot of other things didn't, is something I look at could be part of this approach. Conduct a collaborative, in-depth problem and solution analysis, which we are doing. Carry out collaborative action planning, which we are doing now and will do ahead. Organize collaborative implementation and promote adaptive management. So perhaps it can, and perhaps we've already started doing this. In fact, as far as I can see, this very masterclass is completely collaborative in the way it's done. Do think it over.
Thank you, Urmila.
It's refusing to move to my last slide.
Okay.
This is a thank you to Sita Mumbai.
Okay.
And thank you, ideators and organizers, for the opportunity and much more.
Yeah, I think.
With some hope, that's where we are.
Okay, good. So we have some questions from the
Sure.
people have asked. While I get that organized, I will actually request the participants to take our normal poll. It must be now on the screens. Please give your feedback about how this particular session was.
So Ajit, I think I'll stop sharing.
Okay, fine. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we'll take up the question while they can answer it. The first one is from Mr. Ravindranath. He's from Trivandrum. He's actually one of our most frequent listener. Mr. Ravindranath, can you please ask your question?
Yes, actually, Madam has taken us throughout world and shown some wonderful presentation showing the landscape approach. And when we think of architects, we think of big buildings and flats, etc., etc. But this is a new approach which is giving us a lot of insight why landscape is important. Anyway, towards the end of the presentation, Madam has shared her own contributions, which also I wondered, but she has covered it very well. I congratulate her for this wonderful presentation, showing the importance of landscape approach, which is badly needed now when we have a lot of carbon emissions, etc., in cities where mostly structures are built. Now the business people wanted malls only, not landscape approach. This is a new thinking. This has to be propagated widely in India, especially, of course. Throughout the world now, people are taking this approach. It was one of the best presentation I could see. Why an architecture is going for this landscape approach, which is badly needed in the modern world when we are villages are turning to urban areas and more RCC buildings are coming up. But we use the land for building solely, not for building landscape. This is my view. I would like to hear from Madam whether I have answered.
Firstly, thank you so much, Mr. Ravi, for the compliments. And what you say is very true, that we tend to equate land as a base for putting up buildings. And we consider buildings and the revenue that we get from them as the only possible use that we have. We also
Actually, I am coming from
you want to say something?
Village where I am from an agricultural family. Now,
Right.
when I go back after 20, 30 years to my native place, I can't see any land. There only buildings are there. It's very, very sad situation now. Anyway, Madam can continue this sharing your experience. You have taken us a tour of the world, how landscapes are built. Very good presentation. Anyway, I would like to hear from you more if
Right.
time
So
permits.
actually, I was coming to the same situation of agriculture. The way we have handled agriculture, which actually sustains us, has ended up making it a profession of subsistence. And that is the reason why the perception that agriculture is a loss-making profession tends to make our people in the village aspire to going to the city. However, very slowly in our own country as well, there are people who are opting to go back to agriculture, to growing your own food. And this is not restricted just to villages, but even to cities. So there is a movement which is called edible landscapes, which talks about growing your own food, also using waste to grow your food on, so that you don't add to waste and landfills and add to the pollution further. So these are probably relatively unknown, and I completely agree with you that they need to be advocated and need to be spread more. And what we really need to see are the success stories. because it is the success stories that convince people. Even though I present it to you and I propagate it, I do myself live in a city and I live in the circumstances that all of us do over here. So we need to have more and more of those stories known, and that actually is what would help us as well as our own country. At least that's what I feel.
I fully agree with Madam. And the most important thing is the rulers of this country, especially India, they need some rethinking. They wanted land to be taken for business and then sell out and make big airports. A small state like Kerala has got now 4 or 5 airports. A big state like UP, only 1 airport. See, this is the very tragic situation. And lands are being given for buildings, etc., etc. Thank you very much, Madam, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you, sir.
I enjoyed it very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Then Mr. Ramkumar had put in a question. I mean, I think it's more like an appreciation. Mr. Ramkumar?
Yeah. Very good evening, Mr. Ajit. Very good evening.
Good evening.
I hope I'm audible, clearly audible.
Yes, very much.
Yeah, Madam Urmila, wonderful presentation. I could learn a
Thank
lot.
you so much.
Because basically, landscape, and you have taken us through the world, and you also touched upon the Bombay. Bombay, in fact, I had a lot of tenure. I had about 14 years in Bombay. On the landscape, I do a lot of work on this, water conservation.
Right.
Along with my work, I've been doing that. So I always I give a lot of presentations. Last one was the National Water Mission itself. So I take the example of this Padma Tirtham of Padmanabha Swami Temple.
Yeah.
Which itself is a wonderful example of a beautiful harvesting system as well as a landscape. In fact, many cities we have, depriving of, such parameters. In the landscape, in all projects, I've been also concentrating on providing green landscape at many places with water entry into the soil. Recently also I suggested in one of the places where trees are there, surrounding the trees, make a small gravel pit with rounded stones, so that
percolation.
Water percolates everywhere, and it looks beautiful also.
Yes.
Even gardens also, small, so my idea of talking to you, one particular question in many cities people ask is, there is a wall-to-wall construction. That means boundary wall to boundary wall. They said there is no place for me to percolate the water. So what I suggested, solution is simple. Under the stills, provide harvesting pits or take the terrace water into the well. In fact, a few people have listened to it. And number one, it percolates water into the ground. Number two, some greenery also gets developed at the sites. And the soil also becomes stronger. These small things I keep doing things because I feel working on water, our country will become a water surplus if we are able to use the rain, because nature gives more rain than what we require. This is an emphasis which I've been doing, along with my other activities. So on sustainability, on landscape approach, in fact, I've learned a lot. Definitely, I'll share my thoughts with you and my own PPT presentations. And maybe you can add more value to water along with your landscape and greenery also.
In fact, what you said about Padma Tirtha is very true. We live in a country where most of our ancient systems were already worked out on how to conserve water. All over the country, whether it's step wells of Rajasthan, whether it's systems which are there in Wayanad, whether it's each and every landscape had their own way of doing this, and this is something which we have kind of grown away from. And that is part of the problem actually. But it's very nice to hear that you're doing this work, sir. And very often the opposition to this comes up because water is perceived as something which erodes or deteriorates the buildings. And most of us feel that once we put so much effort into building our homes or houses or buildings, they should last forever. But in actual fact, they do not. So maybe if we were to kind of change the way we look at it, which will not happen quickly, but maybe if we start with children, then somewhere we would be able to bring about a bigger change.
So, ma'am, adding on the point, the soil is, I have been explaining even to very high-profile engineers,
Yeah.
that the soil is a mixture of soil, the moisture and the voids.
Yes.
If proper, water is not there, the soil becomes brittle.
Yes.
This I could explain to one of the senior structural engineers near to our colony, who is also an advisor to government of Tamil Nadu. After I explained to him, he has put more harvesting pits.
Right.
Similarly, when there is no space in the building, for example, in cities, little space is there. So maybe we can plan to have rainwater harvesting below the stilts itself. So the entire water which falls in the plot goes into the ground. I think these approaches will go a long way.
Or also even look at climbers.
Yes.
Because they occupy very little space on the ground.
Yeah.
There is a interesting movie which was available in between on Netflix called Kiss the Ground, which is about soil.
Yeah.
So if it is anybody you meet is from the generation who would watch Netflix, maybe that could be something which would make a difference. Just a suggestion.
Nice of you, ma'am. We'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ramkumar. Next one, Urmila, is from Shanti Ravindran. I believe she's from Singapore.
Okay.
She has an interesting question. Shanti, can you hear
Hi.
us?
Hi, ma'am. Great presentation. Thanks for taking us around the world like this and showing us all the beautiful things we would never have seen. My question is, we live in homes in urban cities most of the time, and we live at home. We are at home most of the time. How do city designers look at making the home landscapes around the home livable and breathable for us?
So
Because we spend most of the time
look
Yeah.
at where we can grow plants in every nook and corner. And Shanti, you live in Singapore as a
Yeah.
So our impression of Singapore is that the aim of Singapore is to be the city in a garden.
Yes, but you see, that is your external perception, right? When you drive from the airport down, you see trees all around. But if you go to most housing estates, the public housing estates where we all live, it's a forest of buildings.
Okay.
Of course, they try their best. We have amphitheaters, we have walking areas, and there's plants everywhere. But still, when you look from your window, you see a forest of buildings, and you can get this feeling of being cooped up. I don't know.
So I
don't know how
you have a city rule for building which is called a land replacement. So when you build, you're supposed to replace that much landscape. This is what we've come across from whatever we've read. I teach also, right? So I do push my students to do a lot of research. So this is what we have. I mean, this is what we've heard about the rules of Singapore. And coming and perfectly understand what you mean by closely packed buildings, because in certain areas of Mumbai we are no less.
Yeah.
And the perception, like I said, is that the plants and roots would grow and damage the buildings, and that is something where our hard-earned money goes.
Yeah.
But if we were to look a little bit and try to see whether maybe we could start with growing whatever we can out of our food. Maybe we can't grow our staple food like rice or wheat or something, but maybe we could grow something like curry leaves, chilies, some of the herbs, and begin with whatever we can. There are several movements that we are seeing here in India, possibly across the world also, which is about this, where terraces, common terraces or common areas, wherever available, are used for growing food. Because food is something where you get an immediate, benefit.
Yeah. So what Singapore does is they have community gardens in the housing estates, and you can go and participate and you can spend the time there. They give the land free and a lot of resources, and we all have balcony gardens, corridor gardens. Even if we have 6 foot of corridor, we can grow a lot of plants.
Right.
And so that's how we, and the good thing is birds do come to these
Exactly.
plants.
That's the most rewarding.
Yeah, and
Butterflies
somehow they have maintained that the birds are there still,
Yeah.
birds and butterflies, and so that's how we do it. But I was interested in your opinion. Thank you.
So there is also a concept of something called a vertical garden.
Yeah,
A vertical
Yeah.
garden is a system. I wouldn't call it eco-friendly, but I would say that it brings in the greens because
Yeah.
it is very intensive in terms of costs as well.
yeah.
It conserves water, which can be grown along vertical surfaces. The inspiration from that actually comes from cliffs. Plants cling on to whatever
Yeah.
they get.
Yeah.
But that's the other way that one can, not have to look at those concrete surfaces.
Yeah. 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 Thank you so much, ma'am. Thanks.
Thank you, Shaji. And we have a couple of questions from our Shaji.
Right.
Shaji? Shaji? Yeah, yes, please go ahead, Shaji. Shaji, you have gone mute again.
Yeah, I think I have unmuted again.
Okay, done.
My question is that we had a lot of this cover around the camera and so many other things. So, is there any proposal from the have you got about institutionalizing them and protecting them across the country?
Shaji, the voice is breaking up a lot. Are you in Trivandrum today, or are you in Mumbai only?
Yeah, I'm in Mumbai.
Okay, so I will read
I
out.
think the question is also written, so I can see it in front of me.
Yeah,
So
I
would
have.
you like me to go for the answer?
Answer.
I'll just read the question in fact, so that in case anybody couldn't. So what he's asked is, have you come across any proposals for our carves to be declared as protected environments across India? That was the question 1. And there's a second question. What's your opinion regarding replanting trees vis-a-vis planting seedlings? So regarding the first question, which is about carves, at present, universally at the center, they're not declared as protected environments, but they have been listed by the MOEF, the Ministry of Environment and Forests, and CC, climate change right now. So there is a listing which exists, but as far as official protection goes, it is the community protection which exists. And maybe in a way that community protection is better, because while they are all sacred groves, the need for protection varies from grove to grove. And if you were to have a legal instrument enacted, it would give a flat, direction across, which may not really work as a protection. So this is the current status to the best of my knowledge. And regarding your second question, which was, Ajit, is it possible to go back to that question?
Yeah, replanting versus
Correct.
planting.
Replanting of the large trees versus planting seedlings.
Yeah.
So, replanting, if you look at it purely by survival rate, the survival rate of a whole tree being planted as compared to a seedling is very bad. There are some situations where you replant a fully grown tree. One situation could be if you are required to transplant a tree, where you need to move a fully grown tree from its particular situation for various reasons. It could be that the space cannot accommodate it anymore. It could be a requirement of safety. It could be any of that. So in that case, rather than cutting down the tree, transplanting the tree is the best option. But one of the situations where transplanting whole trees is used very often is for immediate effects. Now, immediate effects is something that no landscape architect will recommend, because there are high chances of plants failing and dying in the process. However, sometimes there are situations where immediate effects are required, and ideally it would be good if it could be put into a good environment where it will survive. Very often you see these large trees being transplanted on medians, palm trees in particular. They come all the way from Rajamandri to Bombay at least, and then they are planted in medians where they do not have space to grow. Whereas if the same tree was planted as a small tree, it would probably make its own space as it grows. So I would not personally recommend planting a fully grown tree in such a situation. A seedling is able to accommodate itself to existing conditions far more better and far more easily, but it will not give you immediate effect. So I hope that answers your question.
With that, thank you, Urmila. I will request Mr. Rajiv to now deliver the word of thanks for this session as well as for our season 1. Mr. Rajiv, please.
Yeah. So, Urmila, it was a master class. Yeah, and in depth to which you have gone to make us understand landscaping and then taking us to an abstract level to landscape approach, a collaborative approach. That's a paradigm for problem solving in life ultimately. I think that's what the whole landscape you have presented, right? And it was very informative, and many of the landscape, the pictures that you have presented, some of them and most of them, of course, even though we have seen, we were seeing it with a different perspective. I think now if we look at such pictures, I think the way we look at will change. I think that is a big takeaway for us, many of us, from this presentation today. Yeah, one of them. So thank you very much for such a wonderful, informative presentation, and as a finale to our the first season of Masterclass, the 10th Masterclass session. So thank you very much once again. Yeah, and I think we have to thank the attendees, the audience who has been giving us huge support for all the 10 masterclass sessions, registering in large numbers and attending in large numbers, and from many different batches and many different parts of the world. So almost across the globe we were getting attendees, as Ajit has said in the beginning, that from US to Australia, covering Europe, Gulf, and Singapore, Malaysia kind of countries, and of course in India, different states, different chapters. I think we got an excellent presentation, and many times I was speaking to some of our friends in different areas. They were telling me that during this COVID time, there were many webinars. I think different chapters and different organizations started, organizing webinars, and what we were told that Masterclass stands out. I think that is, we are very, very happy, and very happy for the kind of support that the CET alumni fraternity, alumni, and the current batch of students and faculty who have been supporting us on this. So once again, thank you very much for all the support and that you have been giving us for the masterclass, right from 1 to 10. And today, Papan for introducing Urmila and Papan for introducing almost everyone other than you yourself in your master class. Yes. So it was, I think Papan for the whole master class, all these 10 sessions, the contribution from Papan was great. The as a creative head of our CETA Mumbai, has been really bringing out the essence of each of the class through meaningful posters, that clearly brings out what we don't see by just looking at the topic. I think that is what was making difference. So Papan, excellent support for all the master classes, and the core committee of CETA Mumbai, for especially I would say Ajit, who was instrumental in identifying the speakers and ensuring that we have a complete diverse set of topics, right from, and each topic was very different and was quite interesting, right from the climate related topic by one of our senior most person in CETA Mumbai, Mr. Shekharan, and today the landscape approach talked by Urmila. I think all of them were identifying the right topic and then selecting. So it was great work, Ajit. So I think that made a big difference, because if the topics were run-of-the-mill topics and I think it would not have sustained the kind of interest, and we were able to do that. Excellent. And then we had, I think and one of the things that we did was we had a core group which was in fact helping the speakers, listening to the speakers, suggesting the speakers, and I think that group that worked very well. So even though most of us are experienced, we have been giving talks all over, but still for a heterogeneous group like this, it is very different. So the kind of the responses, comments and feedback we got from this close group, especially Mr. Shekharan, Mr. Murli, Ajit, Pratap Kumar, and Papan, and I was also part of that group. I think that helped to a kind of fine-tune the talks, so that each one of us were looking at it from our own perspective, different perspective. So the input helped the speakers a lot. I think that also made a difference. It is not that okay, we selected a topic, selected a speaker, and then the fine day the speaker comes and present. It is not so. It has been a process, and that process worked very well, and that made an impact on the quality of our presentation. I think I just thought I would mention it because let people know that what goes behind making this master class a success. So once again, everyone who has contributed to this master class, which was inaugurated by our senior most member of CETA Mumbai, Sri Natarajan sir, and I think we are today a very successful project that we have completed, as we have taken up and completed, and we have all these masterclass sessions. We have a YouTube channel, and all of them are now available, except the last 2 days, and the last one is available on the YouTube channel. In few days time, I think all 10 will be available on the YouTube channel, so you can refer it, and because they have a lot of information and very deep information and each one of these topics. So once again, so each and everyone, if I have forgotten anybody's name or anybody specifically, if I have forgotten anybody, sorry about that. So once again, thank you very much each and everyone who has made today's masterclass a success and the whole masterclass season 1 a success. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So good night, everyone. So till we meet again. Be safe. See you all in season 2.
One should end with a big clap also.
Yeah.
With a huge clap also.
Yeah.
And so I unmuted myself, end with a good clap to cheer us up. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So,
Thanks, Ram Kumar.
Thank you.
thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good night.